The restaurant isn't loud. It's one of those places with warm lighting and linen napkins, the kind where conversations happen in measured tones and no one raises their voice. You're seated across from your daughter and her friend, a woman in her mid-40s who you've met once before. The evening is going well. The wine is good. The conversation moves easily between topics: travel, a recent film, something about the city changing. Then it shifts. Her friend, poised, clearly intelligent, begins describing a frustrating experience at work. A male colleague who interrupted her in a meeting. She's articulate, controlled, but beneath the composure, there's something tight in her voice, something she's watching carefully, even as she speaks. You listen. You don't jump in. You don't cross your arms. You don't glance at your phone. You don't redirect to a story of your own. You simply hold the space, eyes level, body still, expression calm. When she finishes, there's a beat of silence. You say something brief, measured, not a fix, not a reframe, just an acknowledgement that lands cleanly. And in that moment, you might not even notice it. Her shoulders drop half an inch. The tightness around her jaw softens. She exhales. She looks at you differently than she did 5 minutes ago. Your daughter catches it too. She says nothing. But later, in the car, she'll mention it. He was so easy to be around. Most men watching this will assume the moment was about what you said. It wasn't. There's something operating beneath the surface of that exchange, something most men over 60 have never been taught to see. Here is what no one tells men clearly enough. Women, particularly women who have navigated decades of professional environments, complicated relationships, and countless social rooms, have developed something close to a calibrated radar. Not hostility, not suspicion. A finely tuned sensitivity to the signals a man emits before he speaks a single word. They are reading your nervous system, not consciously, not analytically, but in the way that experienced people read a room, through posture, breath rhythm, where your eyes move, how your body responds to things that don't go your way. They are measuring whether your stillness is genuine or performed, whether your calm is the calm of a man who has resolved something in himself, or the calm of a man suppressing something that might surface unexpectedly. This distinction matters more than most men realize. There is a version of male composure that is manufactured, a stillness built on the effort of appearing in control. It has a particular texture. The jaw is slightly too fixed. The smile comes a half-second late. There's a quality of monitoring, watching oneself from the outside, that registers as a low-grade vibration women learn to recognize early in life. And then there is composure that comes from somewhere different, from a man who has been through difficulty, loss, failure, or grief, and come out the other side without bitterness, without the need to prove anything to the room. A man whose sense of himself doesn't depend on the next 30 seconds going his way. That second man doesn't need to announce himself. He creates a specific sensation in others, not awe, not attraction necessarily, but something more precise: safety. The feeling that nothing alarming is going to happen, that the emotional temperature of the room is unlikely to spike because of him. That disagreement won't become injury. That silence won't become punishment. This is what women are reading in men over 60. Not accomplishment, not status symbols, not even kindness as a performance. They are reading whether the internal work has been done. And here is what makes this psychologically complex. Most men in this age group have never framed their inner life in these terms. They were raised to manage behavior, to do the right thing, say the right thing, appear reliable. They were not raised to examine the energy beneath their behavior, the unresolved grievances, the ego that still requires validation from every room it enters, the pride that stiffens when someone younger speaks with more authority. That unresolved material doesn't disappear because a man turns 60. It transmits. Women feel it. They adjust their behavior accordingly, and often they do so without ever articulating why. It would be too simple and dishonest to frame this as a clean formula. Do the inner work, earn the safety signal, attract trust. That framing flatters the audience without serving them. The reality is more nuanced. There are men who have done genuine psychological work, who have confronted grief, examined their defaults, softened without weakening, and who still find themselves avoided by certain women in certain contexts. because safety is not a universal constant, it is contextual. A woman recovering from a specific type of relationship may be wary of calm, authoritative men, not because those men are threatening, but because that precise combination once preceded damage. Her nervous system is calibrated to a history you weren't part of. That is not your variable to control. There are also men who misread this entire dynamic and pivot toward a kind of performed softness, a studied gentleness that telegraphs effort rather than ease. They ask too many questions. They over-explain their emotional availability. They signal safety so deliberately that the signal itself becomes noise. Women who are perceptive, and the women worth engaging at this stage of life almost uniformly are. They feel the performance behind the performance. Authentic stillness cannot be executed, it can only be inhabited. And there's a third complication worth naming. Some men, in the genuine pursuit of calm authority, drift toward emotional distance that registers as coldness. The man who never loses his composure because he has, in a meaningful sense, stepped back from full engagement. That is not safety, that is vacancy. And perceptive women distinguish between the two more quickly than men expect. What this means practically, the work being described here is not a social technique. It is not adjustable by context in the way a communication strategy might be. It is a quality that either exists in a man or is still in development. And men at 60 have both the advantage of lived experience and the risk of calcified patterns, habits of emotional management that were adaptive at 35 and limiting at 62. The question isn't whether you appear composed. The question is what your composure is built on. Assuming a man has done some version of the internal work, or is committed to doing it, what does this actually look like in daily interaction? Not grand gestures, not therapeutic disclosures, not a rebranding of personality. It looks like a series of small, consistent, barely visible choices. It looks like the pause before you respond when something irritates you in conversation. Not because you're suppressing the irritation, but because you've learned that your first reaction is not always your most useful one, and you trust yourself enough to wait a moment for a better one to arrive. It looks like the way you handle being corrected, in public, in front of others, by someone younger, or by someone who does it without much grace. The man who has resolved his need for validation doesn't stiffen and redirect and subtly punish. He considers the correction honestly. He either accepts it cleanly or disagrees calmly. Either way, the temperature stays level. Either way, no one in the room needs to brace for what comes next. It looks like how you inhabit silence. Most men, particularly men who built identity around competence and productivity, find silence in social settings mildly threatening. The instinct is to fill it with information, with humor, with a pivot. The man who has done the work can sit inside silence without reaching for the nearest exit. He can let someone else's emotion land without immediately trying to resolve it. He can hold presence without needing to hold the floor. These behaviors compound. Over time, over many interactions, they create a reputation that doesn't require maintenance because it isn't built on performance. People begin to seek a man out not because of what he offers specifically, but because of how they feel in his vicinity. Conversations with him don't leave a residue of subtle tension. There's no decoding required, no adjusting of tone based on his mood, no wondering what version of him will show up. That consistency, not perfection, but reliability of character, is what women over decades of navigating difficult men learn to recognize and move toward. It also notably affects how men treat men in this stage of life. The colleague who doesn't posture, the friend who doesn't compete, the mentor who listens before advising. But that's a parallel thread. The direct application here is simple to describe and demanding to practice. Show up the same way when things go well and when they don't. Let your behavior be readable. Let your reactions be proportional. Let your silence be presence rather than withdrawal. This is not weakness. This is the highest form of social discipline available to a man of 60. There is a version of a man's life, a version most men in this age group have encountered in someone they knew, perhaps a father, a mentor, an older colleague, where the final decades are defined by a specific quality of authority that requires no enforcement. Men of this kind walk into rooms and the atmosphere adjusts slightly. Not because they demand anything, not because their history is announced, but because something in their bearing communicates a settled relationship with themselves, an acceptance of what they've done and not done, a freedom from the need to revise their own story for the benefit of the audience. They are not trying to impress anyone. And that, precisely that, is what makes them impressive. This is where the principle that began at a restaurant table, in a quiet moment of composed listening, expands into something that shapes a legacy. Because the men who are remembered well, not just respected while living, but genuinely mourned when gone, are almost never remembered for their accomplishments alone. They are remembered for how they made people feel in their presence, whether the room was safer because they were in it, whether difficult conversations were possible with them, whether the people around them, daughters, colleagues, old friends, younger men watching, felt that here was someone who had earned his own approval and therefore didn't need to extract yours. That is the prize at the end of the work described in this video. Not social strategy, not a technique for earning trust, but an identity, a settled, unperformed, genuinely inhabited version of yourself that becomes the environment others grow within. This is the particular gift available to men over 60 that younger men cannot replicate. Not because younger men lack intelligence or intention, but because this quality cannot be rushed. It requires actual years, actual losses, actual encounters with your own worst defaults, revisited enough times that you've stopped being surprised by them and started being responsible for them. The man at the restaurant table, the one whose stillness caused a woman's shoulders to relax half an inch, he didn't learn that in a seminar. He arrived there through something. A divorce he didn't handle well and then eventually did. A professional failure that required rebuilding. A grief he had to sit inside long enough to understand. A conversation where he caught himself being defensive and chose slowly to try something different. None of it was dramatic. All of it accumulated. And the result, visible in a quiet restaurant, in a single moment no one planned, is a quality of presence that cannot be faked, cannot be shortcut, and cannot be taken away. Here is the question worth sitting with. When the people who know you best, your daughter, a close friend, a woman who has known difficult men and learned to read the difference, when they think of how it feels to be in your company, what do they feel? Not what they admire, what they feel. That answer is the actual measure of where you are. The work is not about becoming more impressive. It's about becoming less of a concern and more of a place where people can exhale. That is the authority no room can take from you.